Welcome to Powered by People, the business podcast from Three Hills that explores how people strategies transform organizations. In each episode, we meet an inspirational business leader accountable for their business's readiness to win in tomorrow's world. I'm your host, Tim Pointer, a Chief People Officer and an operating partner at Three Hills, where we work to advance organizational performance across our portfolio of outstanding businesses. Joining me today is Melanie Steel, whose career has moved across multiple sectors and a variety of transformation projects. From the Ministry of Defence to Unilever, from the Cabinet Office to insurer RSA, from Boots on the High Street to Arriva on the railways, and from design and engineering partnership Arriva to global travel management company ATPI. A chartered fellow of the CIPD, she's ranked by her peers as one of the most influential HR leaders working in the UK today. Let's go hear from Melanie. Melanie, welcome to the Powered by People podcast.
Thank you.
Very good to see you. We have a lot to talk about.
Okay.
You have the most unique career history.
I mean, it was deliberate, actually. So starting in public sector with the Ministry of Defence, that was really my first kind of landing point. And the public sector were amazing in kind of sponsoring my training and my development, and also very early on allowing me to move around into different types of roles, different locations. So I guess I always say that was a bit like, I didn't go to university, so that felt like that was my university, but with pay a little bit to really get my career going. And I think what I discovered quite early on, that I was quite good in things that needed a direction of change. That's when I realised the more kind of industries I could do it in, the change, transformation, and drive that partner with the business, I just hoped that would make me more marketable later on. And meanwhile, it would really help me to be able to, you know, enjoy doing things in a different market, in a different sector, in a different operating model. I try and choose purpose-led, I guess, companies, leaders. People often ask me, how did you end up with these companies? And quite honestly, obviously, they had a change and transformation that needed to be driven. But in partnership with that is, can I work with this CEO, CPO?
Do you say no to work?
Yes.
That's really interesting.
Yeah. More so than I say yes, which is difficult, I would guess, in this, you know, in the current market. But I always talk about professional chemistry.
What does that mean to you?
I think whoever you're driving the change and transformation with, you have to have some synergy. That's not the same as having the same profile or anything like that, because more often than not, right, when you're doing change and transformation, you are going to get into situations where you're going to challenge, you know, particularly the status quo. But I think if you've got a level of understanding with that person where you feel, I mean, people say, well, how do you know? You've like had 3 conversations potentially with them. But obviously in our line of work, you know, there's something that just makes you think, yeah, I think I can work with this person. So when you really get challenged and you're really having to tell them quite often things that they might not want to hear, but you're partnering with them to move it forward. Well, you mentioned ATPI, a global organisation, and it's based in over 30 countries.
And they're a travel management provider.
They've got some other strings to their bow. So they also do large scale events. They support the travel for events. And also quite interesting, part of their business is getting people to work in complex areas. So for example, getting people to work in the marine side of things. Obviously during COVID, that became even more of an issue of getting people to remote locations to do work. So it was part private equity owned, part management owned. And I met the CEO, and he had worked with his leadership team on changing some of the infrastructure side, the tech, the financial side. But the one thing that they hadn't really focused on that was people. But I guess that global enablement of the organisation.
And what was that people change that they were seeking to get delivered?
They were doing things pretty well with people in the local market side, but what they hadn't got was anything that gave them that helicopter view. So they were struggling. I think the CEO was struggling to kind of drive that strategic agenda in the business, which he felt he had quite in hand for the finance side of things and the core customer side and the tech side. But he really felt that gap and would have to go and speak to, 30 odd managing directors to move something. And, he was like, well, there's got to be a better way of doing this. And so initially it was really a conversation with him about, what do you think? What could we do? And he was, but I just need to tell you what I absolutely don't want is, to kind of form this corporate, as he called it, model, as he called it, where there's this, big shared services and, the people in the markets lose the ability to make things happen quickly. And he said, well, how do you feel about that? Because you've worked for some pretty big, and, I was like, I completely agree. I don't have a playbook that I can just bring out that one size fits all. Whatever you do in terms of whichever part of your business, it needs to be aligned to what your business strategy is and what you're doing for the future to get the best out of it. Many things I do is not radical at all, because it's aligned to what the business needs.
It's an evolution.
Yeah, for sure. And, you start off the journey and then they need to progress it and continue to progress it.
So is it a case, in that situation, it sounds like there are some pieces that need to be brought together. So there has to be a global intent. You're working with global customers, so there has to be a shared experience, which is going to be true whichever country that you're interacting with the business across the world. But there has to be enough flex within the system that you can engage locally in terms of the culture, the governance, the legislation. So you can't control everything, and that's difficult to find that break point, I would think, between what needs to be the same or what needs to be different.
We always start with, what is the business here to do?
Yeah.
What are you trying to achieve? What is your 5-year plan? I mean, beyond 5 years now is pretty hard to kind of think, but what is your 5-year plan and what can we put in place to enable that to be successful? So, looking at their plan, they weren't the most cheapest. They were kind of in that mid-market space. So that personalization of service was really important to them. So anything that you put in needs to give enough flexibility, obviously, to allow that. That was their competitive edge. So to take that away and put in, blockers, as I would see them, and barriers would have been a disaster for them in that sense. So
what did you do?
Well, I think it was that missing piece of the strategic piece. So where can we come together to use our influence and power of the brand, which they weren't really utilising on that global scale, to make things better for the employees who work there, but also, be more profitable as a business. That's why they're there. And so we did some stuff in the people model, which we did for the first few months and got right people in right roles and such like. But the kind of second bit, which was great to kind of be part of with them, was, very quickly, we kind of got the people together who were in these roles in the local markets and supporting managing directors on the people agenda. And, the simple question was, when we all got together, was if we did 2 or 3 things strategically, what would give the most benefit both locally and obviously we asked the management team that same question. And it was really interesting, like the overriding thing that had come through was, because they'd had to regroup after COVID, actually 80% of the people they had in their business today were not in their business 3 years prior.
Okay.
But that was the same across the organisation. And I know this sounds bizarre, but it's only when you start getting all the information together that it suddenly hits you like, this is huge for a company culture. And I think what I'd recognise was there was a lot of the people in the senior roles had stayed with the company and they were travel industry experts. Typically in the travel industry, people join it, they love it, they stay in it. But the people they recruited were outside of the industry because a lot of people chose to retire or they'd moved, work or lots of different reasons on the back of COVID. And what I kind of was observing was there was probably a disconnect between what they were assuming people were thinking, feeling, wanting versus the actual, because they were looking at it through the same lens. And so, you know, when we all got together, they were like, we don't know whether we should do this or should do that in the people. The managers were struggling to kind of work out, where do we put, if we're going to focus on 2 or 3 things, what should they be? I mean, at a local level. And so I was like, well, what data do we have? I'm always data hungry. And yes, I've got this great gut that gives me intuition and stuff, but actually so I had all the financial data, but of course the thing we were lacking was the people data. And, you know, nowadays, even without great systems and tech, you can pull it together. You know, spreadsheets are still, unfortunately, the bedrock sometimes. And that's how I kind of got to see the start date, you know, doing a very simple exercise on that. And the great thing about working with, you know, private equity, management-owned companies is you put a good idea on the table and they snap it and they go, great, when can you do it by? And so that speed of pace appeals, but it's probably the first time that I'm like, oh, okay, well, I'm staying then and I'm now doing this. And they were like, yep, you understand now, you know. Okay, let's get this done then. Let's do what we typically call, you know, an engagement survey. But they were really keen, if we were going to do this, then we needed to do it quickly, needed to be led by the business. All things that companies say sometimes, but I knew with this company, they truly meant it. And they didn't have big supporting areas. So, you know, I went and befriended the CIO because we need the tech. It was great. They put in teams globally. So they knew where the hotspots were, you know, because sometimes systems, you know, IT systems are bandaged, as I call it. You know, what you see on the front is not necessarily, you know, the rework that has to go on behind the scenes to get everybody on that. And they had an amazing marketing team that were doing great marketing externally. Didn't have anything internally, but I felt, look, they understand the brand better than anyone. They live, sleep and breathe it. I need them to come on this journey. And then obviously the new head of HR that we put into the role, you know, it was, hey, and here's the first time out we're going to do this.
But that alignment of the digital capability and function with the brand capability and function alongside the people function and capability, to me, that's the holy trinity in terms of driving that transformational work.
Interesting you say that.
Go on.
But, well, typically people talk about, don't they, finance. And to me, I'm like, well, then the money's the money, for not to be rude, but in these scenarios. And I say the first person I always want to meet is a CIO or whatever the title is of the tech side, because tech and people and the business strategy, right? But they had the strategy. They'd spent a long time on that. So that bit was there. But yeah, you're right. You know, I do think that's, you know, people who create and understand the brand and are trying to get customers in. Well, there's no different, is it? We're trying to get, you know, employees, colleagues to stay in the organization and flourish.
Yes.
So they get it. Yeah. I needed them.
So you've got a leadership team there that's been there a long time.
Yeah.
Leading a team that 80% of whom weren't there 2 to 3 years ago. And also who have come into the business during COVID. And we all know that the experience of orientation, induction, well, we know that whole process of being a newbie is very different during that time, because you were often remote working, you know, had a very different, you know, if you were meeting people, you were wearing masks, etc., etc. It's a very different way of coming into a business. So you were walking into a situation where there was a disconnect that hadn't been fully appreciated. You're then pulling together brand, digital, and business strategy, and finding that sweet point where they come together, and you can bring the insight from the people by shock of horrors, asking them what's going on for you, and drawing that together globally.
Yeah.
So what action did that then lead to across the business?
They were really personalizing to their customers in the region. So it needed to be something that we could plug and play this time for sure, in terms of being able to translate the content of what we were going to ask them to complete, you know, because we expect them to talk locally in their local language in the business. So I guess how we created it and rolled it out had to mirror how we were demonstrating the business to the customers. Does that make sense? And I think otherwise it feels odd to people when it's kind of disjointed, in that sense.
But the brand piece is so important because
exactly.
Brand is not just something that you're articulating to your clients, to your customers.
Yeah.
It's something that you're living internally, and then you get that absolute join up of the experience. It's not just a customer experience, it's a colleague experience as well.
100%. And the other thing that was like, you get these nuggets of gold, and I remember one of them saying to me, yeah, well, when they're like in 6 different screens, when they're trying to deliver, and I was like, oh, wow. And what clicked for me at that point was, we need to ensure this is like integrated into Teams, i.e. it just pops up, because that's where they did their business. So they weren't in emails that much. Remember, their front line, most of them are delivering services to the business. And so they're travel consultants, right? So I'm like, right, if we're going to get a good return, if we want them to be honest about it, we've got to make it as easy as possible for them. So the fact we could integrate it into Teams, it just pops up. Can you complete this? Boop, 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 no more than 10 minutes and off it goes. And any notifications were going to come through in that Teams. It meant they didn't have to go into their emails and stuff. So, the feedback was they love the simplicity. They love being asked. And actually, as we all know too well, once you get the information back is when the hard work starts, because you can make some investment decisions which hopefully are going to give you the biggest rate of return. And also what I think the real game changer for the management group was that, I positioned the data with the financial data in terms of, how well each of the regions were doing and countries. And lo and behold, where those that maybe weren't doing so well also didn't have great engagement as well.
So you found a direct correlation between the colleague engagement and the business performance. Yes. What a surprise.
And I think that's where the gold came.
Yes.
Quickly we aligned that I was very clear. I wanted them to see it not as a people exercise, that this was a really big component of what they could use, obviously, to drive that cultural alignment and engagement, but also in the future they were thinking about their options of what might happen to the organization. Private equity companies like to change and such like, and this would give them great insight to be able to use when they might have to speak to future investors and such like, and give that totality of the picture. And so for the first time they were like, this is great, because it's a 360 approach, I guess, to business, rather than sometimes 180, 240, depending, sometimes that bit is not there. And not just giving them the data, but actually helping them to interpret what it might mean. Whatever came out of that, they were going to utilize for their planning for the next year. And they were serious about that. This wasn't a tick box exercise. Again, this company, if they invested, which is quite a bit of money and time for such a company with a smaller budget, shall we say, that it has to wash its face, it has to add value. But more importantly, I would say, is then what could they do with it?
Yes. So you've got all of those pieces. So already they had the information in terms of client satisfaction, net promoter score. Obviously they had the financial performance, so the investors could see how they were performing as a very key stakeholder. But what you did was to progress that whole colleague engagement, and for the first time with this huge amount of new colleagues, really got to understand why people were there, how they were being set up for success and how they were not being set up to succeed. That must have made a difference to the colleague retention as well.
Yeah, I think, when you're kind of recruiting from different industries, people expect certain different things. And of course, the world had changed, right, straight after COVID. And one of their concerns when I joined was the turnover rate, because typically before COVID, the turnover rate was quite low for the industry average. But then it kind of had spiked. And now some of that is just about people maybe not knowing, straight after COVID, we all went through a huge change. So not everything is equal, but I think people really appreciated being asked. The other thing was there was a lot of happy people. Sometimes we do these things and we focus on the negative, but generally when I saw the results coming back, like if I looked at Asia and the Middle East, it was like, we love what we do. We love doing this, and we had thought about changing some things. And, that's a really good information part as well, when it kind of tells you don't change it.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's working,
Because the first question you normally get asked is, what are you going to do differently? It's a case of, no, this is what we're going to do the same.
That's how I started every presentation. I'm like, so what is going so well? And the thing we'd noticed was they'd worked to put the business back together, right? That there was a certain amount, and I see this in all businesses sometimes, that they forget to celebrate the success.
Yeah.
I was like, wow, this is amazing you've managed to do. And they would like listen to me and go, really? Is it?
Well, you don't know. And that's where, because of the breadth of your experience, if you are going from organization to organization and saying, this is what I've seen elsewhere, but also this is what I see within your organization, this is really special. And there is a secret sauce there, but it's never been fully appreciated before. That's where the external perspective can be so valuable.
Yeah.
Because there's that sudden appreciation. And I think there's also the piece that you talked about earlier with that intentionality, which is in global businesses, you can have hotspots of really good practice going on. But in order to pick those pieces up and then take them across the organization and to succeed with intent, then means that you have a knowing culture, which is then setting up future performance. Because it's like, well, Harriet's been working on that piece of work and Jim's been working on that piece of work, but because they're in different parts of the world, they didn't know what one another was doing.
And that's a really good point, Tim, that you kind of raised there, because one of the things the CEO, I think, at the back of his mind when we started this work was he was traveling the world, obviously, seeing what was happening. And he would often say, oh, can you talk to X or Y and obviously you can do that. But what he was missing was a point person, I guess, in group, for a better expression, to be able to join that up. Because I always say, you can ask two people to speak together like managerial, but actually the thing we're great at is that business and people pit, right? So that glue. So two things had come up when that celebrating success. He saw that they brought something in India where I think once a month they got together, at lunchtime, and they would do the awards type thing. And they used to do that all the time before COVID. But since COVID, because everyone was so busy doing the doing, other countries had dropped it. And so he's like, well, we can just take one scheme and let's do it globally. And then once a quarter, let's celebrate, bring the best of the best, which is such a simple thing. But the reality was they'd lost that over time. And you can understand why, right? I mean, everyone was running as quick as they could to get a business fully operational again on that. And the other thing was he was very passionate about, he would meet people and they would be amazing at a particular discipline. IT was one of those. And he would be like, okay, well, we need someone in America to do that. Why don't you? And you can imagine people are like, what is he doing? He's doing. But I came in, I'm like, that's amazing. That's such great career progression. Obviously, not everyone can do that. But actually, we could start to look at what could we do, it more intentionally in the area and be able to explain why people were moving from A to B. But then actually they were working with their managing directors in their local areas, working out, okay, what more can we do here? And suddenly they were kind of feeding back going, I've gone from being, an administrator, and we had so many talented people, very qualified people, as you can imagine, in some countries, who were able to, partner up and really add that value, which we all say is what's needed, And I think the management group, the greatest gift I got, before I left was, wow, you've really shown us about how if we bring it all together, how much more we get from that from a business performance perspective. And I guess my two things is I always like to leave an organization that has, from a professional point of view, more knowledge than what they had. I try and share as much as I can. And secondly, that the leadership team really understand that, people is a key part of business performance. And although the basics need to be done, actually, you're really missing out if you don't have that added value, strategic element, in your business too. So
that's fantastic. It's a great project to leave, knowing that you shifted from point A to point B, but also to have embedded the elements that, your legacy is not just that. Your legacy is the knowledge that you've progressed across the business. I think sometimes we talk about cultural change and people are like, what do you mean by that?
Yeah.
But I think what you've really demonstrated in that example is all of those elements when it comes down to communication, to celebration, to people having the resources that enable them to work in the most effective way, to teams being able to collaborate effectively, and that sense of how great leaders can turn up intentionally to progress the talent that's within their team. Now, we could talk more about that, I know, but I want to make sure that we move to another part of your experience, and it was the Arriva rail work that I was particularly interested in.
I mean, look, it started off as they needed an expert in people to come in and to look at how they might take forward the people organisation, which I did, help them to recruit someone to lead that. But at the same time, they had a transformation. They called it a modernisation programme in play. And of course, lo and behold, when you're talking about modernisation, a huge amount of it, yes, is people, isn't it? We've got the tech, we've got the processes. In this situation, there was the infrastructure side as well. But I'd been involved in one of the things they were looking to do was to put night services on. So the London Underground had done that, but their client was TfL. And so, TfL are a hard client. Lo and behold, I kind of understood it a bit because I'd worked in government, cabinet office. So I kind of understood some of that, behaviour bit of they demand a lot. And I quite like that as a customer. They're very hot on, we want to be progressive, we want to do this. Anyway, to cut a long story short, they had, as part of their agreement, said that they would like to implement night services on those lines too, which would then obviously give them a much bigger join up in addition to the tube. And one of the things, again, I liked about when I spoke to the organisation, their lines run through some of the areas which are less, financially affluent. So people that use the public transport are not party people. I mean, you do have the party people kind of using it, but are people who have to work nights.
Absolutely.
And have to do, the work which is so much needed. And, TfL wanted to be able to give them safe passage of travel. And that was something that was like, oh, I like this. This is like bigger purpose stuff. That's the kind of the civil service, I guess, in that sense, and public sector. But obviously, as anyone knows anything about rail, there a lot of the employees, particularly drivers and stuff, are on very old school, traditional T's and C's and are heavily unionised.
Yes.
You're going to have to negotiate in the sense of a new service, because trying to go back in time, we'll never get it to go. So, for example, I think they'd said it'd taken about 3 years of negotiation. This was a 7-year deal or something. So we would have been halfway, and I didn't have 7 years to go there. So you're asking them to work unsociable hours. You need to do it voluntarily. Like, this isn't the time where you're going to try and get someone to do something for nothing, is basically what I was saying. Not saying that all businesses do that, but sometimes there is a thing where they think about it in their way. Obviously, the finance director took one look at me at this point, and I could see that we might have some challenges. And I think the CEO at that point looked, or the MD was like, oh God, I'm going to be in that trio. And the ops director, who was very knowledgeable of the railway, said, absolutely. And we started off and I said, well, before we go anywhere, let's put a strategy together for negotiation. And they were kind of like, what? And I said, well, we've got to be able to get people to drive these trains. Without that, everything else doesn't exist. So we could go down this black hole forever. So let's just see if we can get that to happen. And let's talk numbers.
Operation is pragmatic. And as you say, you weren't there to mess about.
Let's learn the lessons from where this has gone wrong before, where they were negotiating as part of existing terms and stuff. And I kind of had a thing, look, you're asking people to work unsociable hours, at an unsociable time. So surely I guess my ethical bit was the money should reflect that. We created the strategy. We went to what is our absolute top of what we're willing to pay for it. in return, because this is so important to TfL, it was their number one thing that we said we could deliver when they awarded the contract. So it has to be in that 18 months of a new agreement, you've got to give them something big.
Yep.
And then that sets the scene maybe where things get a little bit tougher afterwards, right? Because typically with these contracts, as they go on, it gets harder to drive through. I also thought the modernisation programme for the stations was going to be a much harder thing to do. And obviously time has shown that that's been near enough impossible in some areas to drive some of that. So it was like, you've got to give something big. And that's what we did. So we had our numbers, we went in, we asked for volunteers, we did it quickly, really push. We need to do this. TfL were like, you'll never get it over the line by then, but we want it. And long story short, we did do it at that time. Then it feels like you've got a win. Do you know what I mean? In a leadership. But they also had a win because they got a good deal with it too. And I think that was probably one of the proudest things of seeing that come on. As I said, I went when it opened, launched, 11:30 at night on a Saturday night, and speaking to the people that were like, this is so great. I work in a hospital. I work in a factory. I can't afford Ubers. I kind of, try and walk it. I'm super scared of that. All of these things where you kind of go, it was worth every minute of that. It seemed great to kind of separate everything back in the day. But the reality comes is trying to join up all those stakeholders to do something different. It brings such a huge program nightmare. And of course, nobody will do anything unless they dot the I's and cross the T's, quite rightly, because we're talking about passenger safety.
Absolutely. When you turn up with good intent and the way that you've set out that logic in terms of this is the benefit to, a city of 8 million people.
Yeah.
This is the difference that it's going to make to, UK PLC fundamentally.
Yeah.
In terms of meeting people where they are, understanding the needs of our fellow Londoners, and then to want to understand all those 25 perspectives and to work out the art of the possible. It's hard work, but it's really interesting work. And when you show up with respect and curiosity, but also with a very clear outcome in mind, that there is something very human about the work that you lead, because you're trying to find that commonality and then bringing people together to achieve that outcome. But you must be, constantly playing between those that are good energy, that will move quickly, those that are sort of waiting to see which way the room's going to go, those that are going to wait till the very end before they show you their cards.
I often say when I go into organisations, look, I need you to feel you will adopt me for a period of time, but I will leave.
Yeah.
So I set that out from the beginning because I think it's very important to be authentic and be honest, that you're not someone that's coming in and you give them the sense, if you do it well, that you will always be there. So, it's very different than when I was a permanent, because actually what you are then kind of building in is that you're going to be there for, all going well, for quite a period of time. But I think, you've got to be clear about how long you're going to be there and what you're there to do. So you're the person that crystallizes it. And I appreciate the fact is I don't have, the time in to have that emotional connection. But so many of you do. So you will definitely put me on the right path if I'm veering against what that organisation, purpose, morals, values are. But that's not the saying that it probably will be difficult at times, because I am here to make that change.
Yes.
And I think they kind of go, okay, usually around the board table is usually the first, you get the people like nodding, going, great. And then you see the eyes of the others going, let's see, so you get a good indication. But my narrative doesn't change. Whoever I'm talking to, again, you have, as an interim, you go in, you have no status in that organisation. You are there probably by your CV, but that lasts for about 5 seconds,
Because you're not there to create a dependency.
No.
And that, I think, gives you a generosity, because you're constantly giving things away.
Yeah.
You're everything that you want to give in terms of your experience, your toolkit, your stories. And I think the stories are so compelling as well, because you can bring that experience from lots of different organizations and explain the art of the possible. One can resist that by saying, well, that's not how we do things here. But there is still that story told at the right level. Is sometimes there's a bit of resistance to change in terms of, I wonder if they're not serious though. We've done this before. We've done a change program last year, and 2 years before that, and 5 years before that. Nothing really changed. So I think at some of those kickoff sessions, there's a little bit of like, okay, here's another one.
Businesses often have tried to go alone and do it themselves, and they've probably made some change, but they've not got to the end destination, as I call it. I was watching this podcast the other day, and it was talking about experts, and it was saying, there's quite a lot of chatter, nowadays about, well, why would I pay a premium for someone to come in my business and tell me what I already know? If you're paying someone £1,000 a day, probably £950 of that, what you're paying for is the expertise they come in and their purposefulness that they will make it happen. Doesn't depend on their grade, their money, the person getting on with X, Y, or Z. That is their single line focus. They've got to do it within the right way, because you alienate everyone, you're not going to make any change. And then probably, the £50 is for the execution of what you actually do, The point being that actually, I think what I find is when you come in, you give the confidence that typically they've probably got a great plan of what they want to do, but you can also look at that plan with a forensic lens and kind of look at what would work really well and what maybe not so well. And I was reading some nominations for change management transformation, and a lot of them brilliant nominations, but the one thing that kept coming up to me, what methodology did they use? If you're not intentional about anticipating it could go wrong in those different areas, the chances are you'll probably get some way, and then you'll have to go back again and redo it. And that's often what I see in change and transformation. And by that, I think a good example is a lot of people spend a lot of time talking to the senior leadership about the change, getting them engaged, and actually probably doing a lot at that more junior level, of colleagues. But the most important we know from research and evidence is that middle layer.
Absolutely.
Managers who are managing big groups of people and stuff, because that's who they turn to am I getting on board this change, or am I not getting on board? And actually, we know change is incredibly more successful when those middle managers have been able to have the time to absorb what it is and to make the shift for themselves personally and to lead for that change.
Well, if you don't believe it as a middle manager, if you're not giving that energy, that intent, and really thinking through the difference it's going to make to your team, that's incredibly difficult to shift an organisation without having that whole group on.
But they're often overlooked.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's not a deliberate intent of it. 9 times out of 10, I'll look at the technology and I think it's great. But they're like, but no one's using it. That's the usual thing. We're not getting our return on investment. I think we'll have to go back to what we were doing before. And it's like, no, you'll be paying twice for it then, because you've already paid for the system. This is just really about business adoption. You've got to think of these people as people, not machines, and often the putting yourself in the shoes of others, again, is the biggest thing I think you can do to see how will it feel. And therefore, again, that's why I think there's a start, a middle and an end for the person that's doing the change as well, or the phase of change, because the longer that you are immersed with it and leading for it, the more you become part of it.
Yes.
And so your objectivity, which is the thing that makes you the most successful and value add to that business initially, can, you get, it's inevitable, isn't it? You get attached and you think, right, now's the time. If they're going to do phase 2, they've either got to kind of have a go themselves and to do it, and I'll be here from the sidelines, or someone else needs to step in and do that will give them that next phase of objectivity.
That skill of being able to step out and to say, right, I've given you everything that I can, and you're now ready for that next phase of change. That has been absolutely fascinating. Thank you so much for sharing your experience. Fascinating insight into your world and your work. Thank you for joining us. please follow Powered by People, the podcast from Three Hills on people-powered business transformation on LinkedIn or wherever you access your podcasts. Join us next time for more inspirational insight from people leaders who craft people-first approaches that enhance revenue, profitability, and long-term value creation. I will see you next time for more Powered by People.